Hey everyone, this is Tyler here. It's been a while since many of you folks have seen me, and I am going to discuss exactly what has happened the past year or so with me and why ultimately I have decided to quit drinking alcohol. Now, many people here know or may know in the past during my 20s I had attempted, and sometimes I lasted for about 5 months of quitting alcohol. I think the longest I lasted was around 5 or 6 months. I had one period in 2018, right at New Year's, and that took me until like June, and then I just went back into it. And at that point, I was like 25, 26. It was more of a novelty thing. It was very vanity based. I had no reason, no major stresses in my life to continue doing it, but I just did. It was a really poor mistake on my behalf, but it just happened. And I had many times from that point on where I tried quitting. And if I go back to my early 20s, I still remember people almost immediately after I'd started frequent drinking, like a former host family of mine in South America, and they had strongly advised me to stop drinking. That was like just months after I'd started. I was like 20 years old at the time. This was just over 10 years ago. And I just continued. I had periods there where there was really obvious signs. I had some close friends in Chile, in South America, that had told me that there were instances where it was just totally out of control. Things that I said and did that I never would have done. And also times where I could have put that energy to better use, but I spent it drinking. That takes me up until a video, like in 2019, it was why I'd quit drinking. Unfortunately, I went back to it and I didn't stick to it. Where it really got bad though was I had arrived back in the US. People who follow me know that I was living in Eastern Europe for about 4 years, from 2018 until 2022 or 2021. And then I, unfortunately, because of financial reasons, I had to go back. It was in the latter half of 2021. I went back. Initially, I didn't drink at all, and I felt totally fine. This was for maybe a period of 3 to 5 weeks. Didn't drink, had no issues. Because when I was in Eastern Europe, towards the latter time of being there, my physical and mental well-being was really declining. Financial well-being, of course, and I was just upping it with booze, and that was actually just making it all the worse. And so I got back to the U.S. at that point in late 2021. Now, if we fast forward, it was probably around late December of 2021 when I went back to the booze. Initially, it was not too much of an issue, but over time it worsened. I started working in retail for two major grocery retailers, and that just really compounded my habit. Anyone who's worked in retail, I was just really tired of people I worked with, managers, just constant like overstimulation. That's how retail is. It's overstimulation for most people. And I would just relieve myself when I got home with a few drinks, beer, wine, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, too, I was doing it in secret. I told some family members that I was living with I wasn't going to partake in it because I kind of knew the path that it was taking me down, but I just continued because it gave me a sort of satisfaction and a really comforting feeling whenever I had this. If I was really pent up with rage, or I just wasn't feeling in the right frame of mind, I would come home and just relieve myself with some alcohol. And I will admit there were a couple times, or maybe 5 or 6 times, where I did attempted to quit, and I did for like say a week or a few weeks, but I would always go back to it. What happened though, in the past, when I would relapse, I would go back. I didn't really have heavy withdrawal symptoms. What I noticed though, especially as I transitioned from like age 29 to 30 last year, the withdrawal symptoms were really worsening for me. I had all the classic withdrawal symptoms by the end of this whole cycle 7 months ago. I was just getting worse and worse. I made a really hard effort last year to put a stop to it. I was still working in retail at this time. This was like 10 months ago. I was still struggling. It's kind of a godsend thing because I actually had a situation about a year ago where I was very sick. It was some kind of flu I had, and I was pretty deep into the booze at that point in time, drinking at least a couple, 2 or 3 regular sized bottles of wine a night. And I had this flu illness. Anyone who's had major flu problems knows that you really can't drink. It may have even been some kind of salmonella or food poisoning or something combined. And I remember it was really hard for me. Eventually, by like the 4th or 5th day, I didn't really have to drink. But see, it was like a psychological problem of needing the alcohol. But then I would have these really harsh physical reactions to it because of this illness. And that's why I said it was almost like godsend. Finally, after about 5 or 6 days, I start feeling better. And by then, too, the booze I had tapered off. Essentially, maybe a few days later, I had to go back to this really unpleasant workplace. I had really toxic coworkers. Not all of them. There were a few that were decent people. But it made it really difficult, and it strained me even more. I went back and then slowly started gradually drinking more and more. At that point in time, my drink of choice was mostly wine. Anyone that has been some kind of drinker knows that usually it's about at the level of wine where you start having these more harsher withdrawal effects. If you just say drink beer, I'm not telling people to drink a lot of beer, but anything up to like 8% beer, in fact, withdrawal is not going to be as harsh usually, unless you drink a lot of beer. High volume beer drinker, it's a different story. Now, if you go into hard liquor, it usually even gets worse than with wine. At around March, I kind of started just going back up in terms of quantity that I drink. There were some other things going on with me financially. I can't really delve too much into that in this video, possibly in a future video. That was only around like say March, and then by May, also note that I live in a really hot and humid place in Florida. If you look at the latitude of Florida, it's like almost like being in Egypt in North Africa. But it's even more humid. It's crazy. It would be similar to like Brazil. I mean, anyone that knows me knows I'm like a polar bear. I don't do well with really hot and humid, sticky weather. I don't feel good whether or not I'm drinking or not drinking. Once I hit around May, certainly June here in Florida, it usually starts hitting me hard. I have to either be inside most of the time or I have to be somewhere where getting some kind of like refreshment, some kind of cool air, or just being in a different place, different location. I worked in a really hot like kitchen environment at that time. It made everything worse also with alcohol because I would basically be dehydrating myself, and then I would come into work essentially dehydrated, and then basically dehydrating myself more, being in front of like hot fryers, hot ovens. I would be like sweating like crazy. Also getting to and from work on a bicycle, just a really bad combination. By May, I was starting to have these problems I had in the past. My body was just not responding very well the following morning, and then the hot weather just made it worse. During like the last part of May, that was kind of my breaking point. I was having like tingling in my fingers, major issues with my managers at work. I was being given the responsibilities of a manager or supervisor, but then I wasn't getting any of the leadership authority there or the pay. And I basically reached a breaking point by early June. It's mental and then physical. My body was just in a really bad physical state at that point. I eventually got fired. It's a kind of another story for another time. It was a very ugly way to end my duration there, because I helped this company a lot, this retailer, really helped increase their sales in this department. I got fired. Still continued drinking and whatnot. I actually had officially attempted to quit like in the springtime. That was the first major time where I got family intervention to get me to quit alcohol. Initially was kind of successful. I took like a leave from work, but it did not work. Logically, I still was not ready for that. After that leave of absence, because that was like another month I was gone, I think that was during like April and May, and in early June, I eventually got fired. I was out of work for only a few weeks, and then I got hired by a major fast food restaurant chain. I'm not going to say who it is, but we'll say they make pizzas. This job was actually pretty cool, like the people I worked with and stuff. Still, I was having a lot of physical issues with like the climate, and then of course the booze. That was still kind of my medicine at that point in time. And I continued to partake in this very ritualistic, usually just drinking like at nighttime. At this point though, sometimes I would drink like before work, like in the afternoon, if like my body was still kind of in a state of withdrawal. Only lasted at that job for like a month. That was really the end of the major episode of my binge drinking. I had got into a point in the latter part of July, leading up to my birthday. I called off work like 2 or 3 times in a row, or it was no call, no show. And then I went on this kind of bender for like 2 weeks straight. I was just like slamming beer and wine, like heavy beer, like 9 to 10% alcohol kind of beer, big cans of it, and those big bottles of wine. I was putting down several of those combined every single day for like a 10-day period. It was like from the 3rd week of July until the end of the 4th week. And that's took me to the point I got fired from that job. And I was feeling absolutely like terrible. Waking up, drinking in the morning, afternoon, through the night, and drinking on these long benders. Now remember too, I was already doing the frequent 1 to 2 bottles every night for like at least a good year with some breaks there. This was kind of the last straw. I knew like my body physically at that point in time, I had all the terrible withdrawal effects. This was the worst I had yet experienced. We also had a very hot summer here in Florida last year. I thought it was going to be not as bad as the summer prior, but it was even worse. So that actually just made it like more difficult on my system. Completely dehydrated. I had gone like over like a 2-week span. There was like 3-day periods where I hadn't eaten at all. It was terrible. I still had to drink though, unfortunately, because if I didn't, I would have the common withdrawal effects. I already was having those effects. Shakes, those typical alcoholic shakes that people have, I had those very severely. I had them in the past, like in my hands, but these were like proper shakes that you see with alcoholics. Just to like illustrate how bad it was, I went for like even 3 or 4 days after I had completely stopped drinking, still had them. I felt fine by that point, but I'd still have them because my body was just, my electrolyte levels and other things were just so out of balance. Potassium levels most certainly were really low. Sodium levels were screwed up. My face was so puffed out. It was so red. My eyes were completely bloodshot. I had the typical stomach, like literally like looked like an impregnated stomach with like kind of that watermelon effect going. It was so bloated out. Even my nails were actually kind of turning that yellowish tint, which I think is tied also to potassium or electrolyte imbalances. I could hardly even speak. My voice would be like barely trembling because my breathing, I had such trouble breathing. because my heart rate was so elevated. Combined with my breathing, my chest was out, or my whole stomach was just inflated from all the excess liquid. Even just to walk a short distance, it would basically put me out of breath. And then I was having, of course, like the psychological, the really harsh anxiety, depression effects. And mind you, at this point, I knew I had started like a taper. And then, of course, like all the sweating, I had to keep my fan running constantly in my bedroom because, as people know, your body just fluctuates like crazy. The temperature, you will have cold sweats, but then you're like hot. And so I would wake up, my bed would be all sweaty. And then I would turn on the fan, but then I would feel cold. It's this weird effect. And then, like I said, the whole psychological of hearing like the chirping birds or insects, seeing things on the wall. On 1 or 2 days, when I had kind of reached rock bottom, basically it was the following day or 2 days after I knew I was going to start that taper. I had such bad trembling and like anxiety, like I was literally having a nervous breakdown or an anxiety attack. And then I was almost at the point of having a seizure, based on what I've heard. Fortunately, I had something to drink to calm that down. And so it was all these factors put together. There was like a 2 or 3 day period, basically, the last of that whole bender, where I was in a state of just, it felt terrible. I mean, I was simply using the liquor to survive. I think if I hadn't had it at that point, I would have gone into some kind of like proper seizure or some kind of health condition. Delirium tremens is another common thing that people here may have heard of. I was right on the edge there. Yeah, I knew that like it was just at its breaking point. So during that like first 3 to 5 days, I just tapered, or maybe closer to 7 days. I tapered off the booze. It was really rough, honestly. I had so much trouble. There was a 3-day period where I didn't sleep for 3 days. People who go through withdrawal know this. Even with having had some to drink before that, like that evening, because I knew I needed a little in my body, but just couldn't sleep proper. I was feeling so bad by the 3rd day. Finally, the 4th night, I slept properly. Just like I said, the shakes, face was all like puffed out my eyes. There's a condition actually I realized I have with alcohol. It's for a different video. But my body was just in a state of disrepair at this point. And then, of course, the psychological part of it, that by this point I was unemployed and I was just internally feeling really terrible. I remember, though, also one other thing. I was having violent situations of vomiting for like the last few days. And mind you, I'm the kind of like or I was the kind of drinker for 8 to 10 years where I didn't really have these episodes, but it was like the last couple days, it was just like constant, and I couldn't hold anything. Anyone who's had severe situations with alcohol knows this. You still want the effect of the alcohol, but your body can't hold it. I didn't totally cut it cold turkey until just like a couple months ago. I was still doing it off and on, mostly lighter, because I had started a new job that I currently do, and I just couldn't completely get off of it cold turkey. This was like a long process. It was a long phase of time. It wasn't going to happen immediately. And I realized that a lot of it eventually was more like psychological. That was the longest part of it, because anyone who's been a heavy binge drinker or any kind of drinker knows that your psychological craving to it is often as strong or even more so than your physical. And that psychological part actually can take a lot longer. And one other thing too, I forgot to mention, like my weight gain was another problem here, because that also compounded the effects of these withdrawals that I was having over the last like year and a half or 2 years. I was substantially thinner when I was in Eastern Europe. Then, especially by last spring, was the heaviest I'd ever gotten. I'm about 6'3". I was 50 pounds more at least than when I left Europe. never been this heavy in my life. So that just made it more intense. And even up to this day, I'm still trying to get rid of these pounds. Alcohol was a big factor there. And then getting off the alcohol, you still have these like massive cravings for sugar, often to like compensate. And you have a social part or psychological part of it that you're craving something, but you're not getting it basically from the alcohol. And often it's for like food and stuff. So that's just obviously work in progress. I'm one that's never really had major issues with weight, with cutting weight. So for me, I know if after a good 2 months, I can get all the excess weight I have now, I can totally get off of my body. And overall, I just feel better. I certainly still have these strong cravings for it. Anyone who's not familiar, alcohol is kind of like a depressant. It's like, they call it like a downer. There's uppers and downers. Cocaine, for example, that's an upper. Meth is like an upper. It depresses your system. What that then does is that it makes it so that it relaxes you, but like it then puts your senses into overdrive when you don't have the depressant in you. Henceforth, those withdrawal effects are basically your senses in overdrive. And that's why like you're on like this extreme anxiety or extreme depression or whatever it might be that you feel with, that alcoholics feel with withdrawal. That's where that's due to, because their senses aren't being depressed like they were in the past. Alcohol is always something that I will crave. I want like everyone in my channel to understand that this was an issue that has been persisting with me for many years. Only more recently took its full course on me physically, emotionally, financially, and everything else. Yes, were there factors that in my life that enhanced it? Absolutely. And things that I thought were kind of unfair, yes. But it's no excuse for using that substance. And there's people that have had more difficult situations that wouldn't have used alcohol for that. It started in my early 20s as a total social situation, social addition to my life. Something I had no cravings for. I didn't drink in my teenage years. Eventually became something that I used to survive and sustain myself, and it's definitely helped create my story. I'm very thankful to everyone here, all my supporters that have been following my channel for thus far. This was like an issue that I didn't get into, and definitely conflicted with my channel and process of putting out content. I think it's something that the community should know about, or everyone should know about, because it does affect everyone. And whether it's good times or bad times, these substances aren't that positive. And yes, there's definitely more to my story here I haven't gone into. There's smaller stories that I'll go into possibly in the future. But I have learned a lot. And where I'm headed in the next year or so is a very different path than I've been on up to this point the past 2 years here in Florida. Yes, most certainly I would like to go back and at least visit Europe, possibly live there again. And I thank everyone here for following me and subscribing here. And just for everyone who learned something, for people who are younger or older, certainly for people in their teens, there's a lot of value in this. And don't ever think that you can't have these kind of issues. When I was in my early years, like say teens or even 20, I never thought like I would have this kind of issue, and how it eventually impacted so many aspects of my life, from employment to finances to social, etc. It was enormous. So take that as a lesson to everyone here. But thank you for watching this video, and have a good Saturday.